Hi guys, it's Jess from Honest Fiction and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I am going to be sharing my August wrap-up. Alright guys, so August was a very interesting reading month. I read 11 books, which is less than my normal, and they range from 2 stars to 5 stars. I read some of my favorite books of the year. I definitely read some of my least favorite books of the year. It was just all over the place in terms of reading. I will probably say this is probably one of my worst reading months. I just didn't have the desire to pick up books like I normally do. I really hope that changes. I know in the fall is like my prime time for reading. I love reading like spooky type fantasy romance and horror, and like I normally really have a good time in the fall, also dark academia. So I'm hoping August was just like a fluke and I'll get back to like really enjoying books again in September. But anyway, let's talk about the books I read. So there, like I said, is 11 books. I will sort this by genre, and if you're unfamiliar with my channel, I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. You can also hit that notification bell to be notified whenever I post new bookish content. You can also check out my Instagram and Goodreads, both linked down below. With all that out of the way, let's talk about all the books I read in August. All right, so starting off, we have A Soul of Ash and Blood by Jennifer L. Armentrout. So this book is a companion book to both the From Blood and Ash series and the prequel series. It's essentially following the events of From Blood and Ash, the first book, but this time, instead of having it from Poppy's perspective, we're getting it from Castiel's perspective. So I will say, you need to be completely caught up on the series before starting this book. Although we're really only watching the events of book 1, this book does start off after the events of A War of Two Queens. So if you have not read A War of Two Queens yet, you are going to be so confused. And I know this because I had a friend that jumped right into this book after reading just From Blood and Ash, and they had no idea what was going on. So definitely make sure you are caught up with the series before starting this. I will say I was nervous about this book. I've been having an interesting time with the From Blood and Ash series. I love the series. It is very beloved. I absolutely love the characters, and I'm going to continue reading the books in the series. However, the last few books I thought were okay. We're getting a little repetitive. We're getting a little drawn out. It's starting to feel a little bit like Zodiac Academy in terms of when is the series going to end, because it does need to end. So I wasn't really sure how I was going to feel about this book, but oh my goodness, I am so happy I read this book because it made me fall back in love with Hawke and Poppy and Castiel and that whole dynamic. I had the butterflies I had when I read book 1, and I miss that in this series. I miss just being so in love with this couple and watching them fall in love, and it was just a great reminder of how this couple started out. And I really enjoyed this book. So highly recommend. I think I ended up rating it 4.75. If you enjoy this series so far, definitely pick this book up sooner rather than later. I just really loved it. And next up I read North of the Stars by Monica James, which is the first book in a dark Viking duology. It's very similar to The Last Kingdom on Netflix. If you have not watched that show yet, you need to. It is absolutely phenomenal. But anyway, this book was recommended to me by Autumn from Nose in a Book, so I'll leave her channel linked down in the description below. But so far, I'm really enjoying the story. So we're following Emmeline, and she is a girl, she is the princess of this Christian king, and her father really don't get along. But one day her father goes out, kills a bunch of people, comes back with a bunch of slaves, and goes to his daughter and says, hey, you can pick one to save and I'm gonna kill the rest. So to just get back at her father for being a horrible father, she ends up picking the Viking that we know her father definitely wanted to kill. So anyway, this Viking ends up being released from prison, and he teaches the army of the Christian king how to fight. And while all this is going on, Emmeline is just slowly becoming more and more attracted to him. And like their friendship goes from being kind of friends to essentially her just having a huge crush on this Viking. Now the Viking knows that if he does anything with Emmeline, he's probably gonna get killed, so he really stays away. And then Emmeline is shipped off to marry another king. Now, the only critique I have of this book is that besides it's very dark, there are parts that are very much just glossed over. I did not love the pacing. So when Emmeline gets shipped off to this king, she's essentially SA'd for like 4 years, but we don't get to see how that really affects her. We just know that she was really unhappy about it. But I wish we had a little bit more of like her feelings and like what she went through. Like there's a very upsetting thing that happens to her, and she mentions it very briefly, and then is very upset about it later in the book, but we have no idea as the reader why she's so upset because we didn't see any of this unfold. So like, I just think there were some interesting pacing choices that I was not a fan of. But anyway, back to the story. So she's very unhappy in her marriage because of what I said. So eventually the Viking, who I forget the name of, it's the Godless, I think it's Stan or something like that, whatever. He ends up going to the kingdom and he kidnaps her, and it was like, I found out what was going on, I'm so sorry. And he tries to save her. While trying to save her, something happens, and she ends up with a new group of Vikings, and the story goes from there. But overall, I did really enjoy this. I really want to know what happens next. This book ended on a crazy cliffhanger that I did not see coming, so I will definitely be reading the second book in the duology in September, and thank you so much, Autumn, for recommending it. And the next 3 books I read as part of a collab vlog that I did with Cheyenne from the channel That Tall Book Girl. So I will leave that vlog linked down in the description below if you want to check that out. It is completely spoiler-free. But first up, I read Home Game by Odette Stone. Now, I have made it very clear on my channel, I typically don't love hockey romances. However, I loved this one so much. So we are following Zoe, and Zoe has had a very, very hard life. Because of some circumstances, she is now homeless, but she's trying to make the best of it. She dresses really tough to make sure people really don't mess with her, and she always makes sure she's at the homeless shelter before closing, because once they close, you cannot get back in. So anyway, Zoe is at a coffee shop. She sees this guy who's really struggling to try to do his taxes. She offers to help. They end up having this conversation, and she realizes she's not going to make it to the homeless shelter before it closes. So the guy's name is Ryan, and he offers to drive her. And the story kind of goes from there. We find out that Ryan is actually a professional hockey player, and he offers to have Zoe stay with him while she kind of gets back on her feet. And I loved them so much. First of all, Zoe as a character, I love how strong she is, and I just really loved getting everything from her perspective. I love Zoe so much because I was expecting her to not be at all the way she was portrayed in this book. When I heard the synopsis for this book, I was thinking it was going to be this girl who was like really ashamed about being homeless, despite the fact it has nothing to do with how she's been living her life. These were horrible circumstances put upon her. But she is able to just be like, own it and be like, look, I've had a rough life. I'm doing the best I can, and I don't want your pity. And I absolutely loved her so much as a character. And I love their romance. And honestly, there were some other characters in this book that I am interested enough in that I do kind of want to read some of the other books in this series. Let me know if you read this series and what other book I should pick up, because I really enjoyed this so much more. So I think I ended up rating this like 4.5, and highly recommend if you're looking for a very emotional hockey romance. And next up, I read Maestro by Auden. Now, I had a physical copy of this book. However, as soon as I finished it, I called my really good friend and said, you need to read this book immediately, and I dropped it off at her house. So I do not have my physical copy on me, but that should tell you I absolutely love this. It was my favorite book I read this month. So Maestro is following Chadwick and Aurelia. So at the start of our story, Aurelia is, I think, 13 years old, and she is auditioning at LaGuardia music program. And when she gets there, she meets Chadwick, who is this like super cool guy from London, who's a child prodigy when it comes to the violin. And they just have this instant like connection. They become best friends. And Aurelia always has like a little bit of a crush on Chadwick, but they're just great friends. And they stay that way up until they get into high school, when they both get accepted into this music program. So then Aurelia starts to have a little bit of a crush on Chadwick, and things slowly progress. And we essentially follow these people and their relationship for 20 years. And normally I am not a huge fan of super angsty books. However, this book was so good. It is an emotional roller coaster. You are going to laugh, you are going to cry. I had a stomachache while I was reading like the last half of this book. It was so unbelievably good, and I just highly recommend, if you're a friend of Friends to Lovers and angsty as F romances, you need to read Maestro by Auden. So definitely my favorite out of all the books Cheyenne recommended, and thank you so much, Cheyenne, because I know I never would have picked that book up had you not told me about it. So definitely check it out. And last up for that collab vlog, I read That Sick Love by Jescie Hall. Now, it has been a little bit since I've read this, so now I feel like I'll have a better time describing my feelings, or maybe not. But this is a very dark romance. We are following this girl that is about to be essentially like baptized into the church, and she's trying to work her way to become like one of the top people in the church, despite the fact that for the most part women really don't hold any power. So anyway, on the day that she's about to be baptized, she is almost killed. We then find out that the church actually has kind of like a vendetta against this girl. We don't know why, and they hired someone to kill her. Well, that killer becomes obsessed with her. He starts stalking her, but he also just like is so infatuated by her and obsessed with her. He doesn't really want to kill her, but also like he was hired to do that, and he really wants her to like come into her own power. And the story kind of goes from there. So parts of it definitely gave me Haunting Adeline, mostly just because of the stalking, and then it very much felt like Ammo Jones in terms of like twistiness. I would even say Heartless Heathens a little bit. But for some reason, I had absolutely no interest in picking this book up anytime I put it down. I could not get attached to these characters. I thought they were interesting. Like, Arrow, the stalker, is so incredibly unhinged. And, like, I loved the narration. So I actually listened to this via audio. I do say, if you're going to listen to this book, highly recommend the audio, because I would have DNF'd, but Joe Arden is just spectacular. But yeah, I don't know what it is about this book. I had no interest in it. So I think a lot of it has to do with the length, and I just read a bunch of like very emotional and angsty romances prior to reading this book, that maybe that's why I just wasn't in a dark romance mood and didn't really realize it. But while I was reading it, the entire time I was like, do I like this or do I hate it? I'm not really sure. And by the time I got to the end, I was like, I just don't think I cared enough about it. So overall, take my opinion with a grain of salt, because I don't think I did any better job explaining why I dislike this book. I really don't know. But personally, this didn't work for me, but I think if you are a fan of dark romances and you like that stalker vibe, definitely check this out and definitely listen to the audiobook. And next up, I read The Summer We Fell by L. O'Rourke. So I will say this author is very hit or miss with me. I absolutely loved Parallel by this author. However, Waking Olivia, I wasn't a huge fan of, so I was very nervous to pick this up. However, this is my favorite book by this author. I loved this so much, and this is also another one that is super angsty. I think I'm gonna have to do an angsty like rec video, because I've been reading a lot lately. This book is so good. So we are following Juliet, and at the start of our story, Juliet has moved in with her boyfriend's very conservative parents because of an abusive home life. Now, when she moves in with her boyfriend's parents, they really treat her, not as a servant, but she's trying not to be a burden. So she's doing a lot of cooking, a lot of cleaning, and the father is actually a pastor, and he uses Juliet's hardships in his sermons, which is like really embarrassing for Juliet. But whatever, she's just trying not to be a burden. And one day her boyfriend comes home with his friend from college, and his friend from college is named Luke. Now, Luke and Juliet immediately seem to absolutely hate each other, but slowly they start to realize that they're very similar, and it kind of goes from there. So this is a love triangle type situation, but oh my gosh, it is so good. My only critique with this book is that it does go back and forth through time, and honestly, I typically don't love that, but I think it really worked in this book. But I wish we got a little bit more from the present timeline, just to see their relationship like how it is now, and like I just wanted a little bit more. But overall, I absolutely love this and highly recommend. And next up, I read Ruined Secrets, and this is book 4 in the Perfectly Imperfect Mafia romance series. So this story is following Isabella. Isabella is the capo's granddaughter, and when she was very young, she almost drowns in a pool, but she's saved from one of her grandfather's men named Luca. Now, after this, Isabella just has the biggest crush on Luca, despite there being like a 15-year age difference, maybe even more than that, but she was just infatuated and absolutely loves him. And when it's time for her to marry someone, because she is the capo's granddaughter, she knew it was going to be an arranged marriage, it ends up being Luca, and she is so unbelievably thrilled. And this story kind of goes from there. So it's a lot, the beginning of the story is very much just Isabella trying to break down Luca's walls, because Luca is like, I have a child bride that I don't want to touch. And I actually really loved that dynamic, because I feel like that's something that's not said very much in Mafia romance. She's not a child, by the way, she's 19, but it's just the fact that there is such a big age difference between them. He's like, yeah, I'm gonna wait till you're like 21 and then we can talk about flirting. But I loved this book, and I will say Perfectly Imperfect, that this series as a whole is my new favorite Mafia romance series, because I adored this book, and it has a trope that I absolutely despise, and this is probably one of the only books that does this trope, and I'm still rated at 4.5 stars. Like, I just love the way the characters are presented. I feel like this author just does such a good job of making you attached to these characters in such a short amount of time. And they're just good. I just absolutely adore these books. So I highly recommend, if you have not picked up the Perfectly Imperfect series, you need to do so. I think I've rated all of the books 4 stars or higher. They're just so good. Also, I just want to say real quick that I love the main character in this. I feel like a lot of Mafia romance, we have women that aren't, there are books with like super strong women characters, but I love the fact that Isabella was the capo's granddaughter and has been working in the community and doing things behind the scenes for so long that she just comes off very strong, and I really appreciated that. So, highly recommend. And last up, I read the first 4 books in the Flight and Glory series. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to be in the live show, but I have a lot of thoughts on these books, so I'm going to share them now. Book 1 was one of my favorites. I think I ended up rating it 3.5 stars, but I think I'm actually going to up it to 4. So in this story, we are following December, and it is a very emotional story. We start off with Ember finding out that her father has been killed in Afghanistan. And it's really just Ember trying to keep her family going and together while also processing the grief of her father passing away. And while all this is going on, she ends up meeting Ryan, who moves back into her hometown, and they start this relationship. And he's really trying to help heal Ember. And it was just a beautiful story. I ended up reading it in one sitting, and I had very high expectations for the series after finishing book 1. Now, book 2 is following another couple. We're following these 2 people. The girl ends up being thrown off a cliff in the beginning of the story into water and is unable to swim. So Jagger ends up saving her, and we don't exactly know who Jagger is at this point. But anyway, we end up finding out that the girl that was thrown off actually is the daughter of someone who's in the military, and she has a heart condition that her sister had previously died from, and she's very like coddled by her family and her boyfriend. And I will say the second book does kind of have cheating, although there's like instant regret after said cheating, and it's Jagger and the mean girl Skylar's like relationship. Then book 3. Book 3 is where started doubting if I really wanted to continue with this series. I don't know what it was about book 3. I feel like other people in this read along also kind of had a similar experience. It was an interesting time. We are following this girl who had something very upsetting happen to her in her other college. She moves in with a group of guys, being the guys that we met in the previous 2 books. And she meets another guy that has a girlfriend, we find out, who's actually in a coma. So we're following, I think his name was Grayson. And he is really torn between really liking Sam, his new roommate, the girl I mentioned previously, or the girl that is in a coma that he was in a relationship with for like 8 years. And it just wasn't a great feeling watching this guy have to choose between the 2. Towards the end, you get a little bit more information that makes the beginning of the book a little bit more palatable because like you find out certain things. But overall, while I was reading this book, I just was not having a great time. So that book, I ended up rating 3 stars. Honestly, it's probably like a 2.5, 2.75. I just did not love it. But then we get to book 4. Book 4 was unbelievable. I love book 4. Book 4 was my favorite by far and was like leagues above the other books in this series. So book 4 is actually following the couple from book 1, Ember and Ryan, but now we get to see them as adults. I mean, they were adults in the first book, but now they've like really come together in their relationship. And Ryan is in the army, and it's Ember and Ryan dealing with Ryan's first deployment and things and events that take place during that deployment, and also just questioning the hardship of being with someone who's in the military when you have to put your dreams aside for theirs and things of that nature. And it was just done so unbelievably well, and I highly recommend maybe just read book 1. Now, I guess you can't because it's really emotional if you read all of the books. But overall, do I regret reading this series? Definitely not. There are certain characters in the series I'm going to be thinking about for a very long time. So overall, I did have a good time. I would just skip book 3 if you're going to read the series. All right, guys, those are all the books I read in August. Thank you so much for watching, and please let me know down in the comments below if you've read any of the books I mentioned. I said this already, I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday, and if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. I will see you all next week. Bye!